Thank you very much. Unlike Jonathan, I don't have roots in this city, and I feel the need to declare myself to be a Manchester United fan. I'm not. How to lose your audience in the first 5 minutes? I was going to say I'm not sure I'm going to get the warm Liverpool welcome that Nicholas has been exhorting you all to give us all. But let's move on quickly, shall we? I am really pleased to be here. I think this morning has been a fantastic morning of awareness raising, but also solidarity building. This is the third conference that I've spoken at in about the last month on Balfour, as well in the past few months at numerous meetings themed around Balfour. In 2 weeks' time in London, as Nicholas has referenced, there's another conference that has several hundred people signed up. There's a debate next week in Parliament, the second debate within a year on Balfour. There's a myriad of other public events and cultural events marking the anniversary. And of course, and I'm going to come back to this, on November the 4th, it is our hope that tens of thousands of people will be joining us in a national rally. All of this activity is really important, and it's been really significant to me that every conference that I've been at has been packed to the rafters, as this is today. It's generated an important debate about what Balfour was and how the UK government should respond to the anniversary. Now, what I want to do, and I'm going to try and leave some time for questions. The deal normally, the unstated deal when you speak at a conference is that you're better informed than your audience. And the level of questions that you've been putting to my fellow speakers makes me slightly nervous that might not be the case. So I'm going to try and leave some space for your contributions because they have been so well informed to this point. I'm going to touch a little bit on the history of Balfour. I'm going to cover some of the ground that David has given us. I then want to bring us up to date by saying something about the situation that Palestinians face today. And I'm going to touch and reference, when I do that, to some degree on the situation of Palestinian citizens of Israel, the 20% of the population of Israel defined by Israel as Israeli Arabs, but self-defining as Palestinians. And I want to say something, not in huge detail, but why we might call Israel's exercise of what I'm going to call an unjust structure of power over Palestinians, why we might give that legitimately the label of apartheid. And there's some link here to what you've heard from Jonathan before, because one of the examples in the accompanying document attached to the 38-word IHRA definition of anti-Semitism has been used to say that to call Israel an apartheid state, and it's been used particularly to tackle students on campus who hold events under the label of Israel Apartheid Week, to say that that labelling, that framing is anti-Semitic. It's not just inaccurate, they say, it's anti-Semitic. So I want to say something about why I think actually it's an appropriate analytical framework to understand what is actually happening to the Palestinian people. But let's start with Balfour and how the British government should react. Most of you will know that the British government has been lobbied this year to issue an apology for Balfour. Some of you may have signed the petition to that effect that went up on the government website. And if you did, then some months ago you would have had the government's formal response. And it read, and I quote, "The Balfour document is an historic statement for which Her Majesty's government does not intend to apologise. We are proud of our role in creating the State of Israel." And later in the reply they said, "We recognise that the declaration should have called for the protection of the political rights of the non-Jewish communities in Palestine, particularly their right to self-determination. However, let's move forward, the task now is to work towards peace, etc., etc., etc. Now, it's a deeply offensive statement, particularly in its reference to the Palestinians as the non-Jewish communities, though of course it is simply replicating the language of the declaration itself. But beyond that, as we've heard, it represents a fundamental mischaracterization of what Balfour was actually about. The true essence or spirit of Balfour was made clear in the memo that he famously wrote 2 years later, which David quoted this morning, but which bears re-quoting, where he said the four great powers are committed to Zionism, and Zionism, be it right or wrong, good or bad, is rooted in age-long traditions, in present needs, in future hopes of far greater import than the desires and prejudices of the 700,000 Arabs who now inhabit that ancient land. And those 700,000 Arabs, or if you prefer, the Palestinian people, of course made up 90% of the population. So as we've heard, Balfour was an act of imperialism. It was generated by a mindset that said it was legitimate for Britain to disregard the rights of the inhabitants of Palestine because Britain's imperial interests were of greater import. But it was also, as we've heard, driven by a further framework of racist thinking that said the rights of the Jewish people were of more importance, held more weight, than those of the majority Arab population. So the UK government's response to the request, to the demand for an apology, is founded upon the continuing myth that there was a way that the demands of Zionism in 1917 could be made compatible with the inherent rights of the Palestinian people. Now, Palestinians at the time understood clearly that this was not true. The Palestinian writer Abdullah Mukhlis said this around that time: "We Arabs fear that the new settler will expel the indigenous and we will have to leave our country en masse. Palestine may be endangered. In a few decades, it might witness a struggle for survival." And there's a story that I've told a few times in meetings this year because it has personal reference and resonance. In 1921, a delegation of Palestinians came to the UK to negotiate with Winston Churchill, then the Secretary of State for the colonies, and they were seeking the overthrow of the Balfour Declaration. The secretary of that delegation was a man called Shibli Jamal, and he was my great uncle. We're hearing a lot today about great uncles. The delegation spent a year in Palestine, fruitless year of negotiation, and to all intents and purposes, and if you read the transcripts of their correspondence and their dialogue with Churchill, with the Foreign Office, they were treated at best like children, at worst like barbarians. But when my great uncle returned to Palestine, he wrote a pamphlet in which he said that the inevitable outcome of British policy as it was forming was that one people, or in the language he used in the parlance of the time, one race, would inevitably come to dominate over the other. So there's a straightforward thread between Balfour and the catastrophe, the Nakba, that ensued in 1948 when the State of Israel was founded upon a process of ethnic cleansing that saw over 700,000 Palestinians, including my grandparents, expelled from their homes. So we know Balfour is not an event to be celebrated or marked with pride. What would be more appropriate would be a process of sombre reflection, acknowledgement of past injustice, but more than a process that reflects back and is historical in focus, what is required is a fundamental shift in current UK policy making. Now, for the past 30 years or more, certainly since Oslo, successive UK government policy towards the Middle East has been framed around a repetition of a tired mantra with which you will all be familiar: a commitment to a two-state solution with a secure Israel and a viable Palestinian state. Just as an aside, Palestinians obviously don't need security, they just need viability. Above all, a paradigm or a frame with a number, I think, of key components. Firstly, that Israel is a liberal democracy with a commitment to peace. Secondly, that the situation that is being confronted needs to be understood as one of conflict, which needs to be resolved by conflict resolution, by compromise by both parties, and by negotiation. And thirdly, that the UK government policy has historically been and must continue to be even-handed. Now, David has dealt extremely comprehensively with the nonsense that UK policy making could be described in any sense or form as even-handed. But the essential framing of conflict and conflict resolution is wrong. What we are dealing with in Israel-Palestine is the establishment and maintenance of an unjust structure of power founded upon racist foundations. And to me, the best and most appropriate analytical and descriptive framework we have to define that unjust structure of power is apartheid. Now, the crime of apartheid is defined by the 2002 Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court, and I'm quoting, as inhuman acts of a character similar to other crimes against humanity committed in the context of an institutionalized regime of systematic oppression and domination by one racial group over any other racial group or groups, and committed with the intention of maintaining that regime. Earlier this year, the UN Economic and Social Commission for Western Asia produced and published a report for a brief while. It then got taken down from their website, which described in forensic detail how Israel's regime of control over the Palestinians, what I have described as an unjust structure of power, meets the legal definition of apartheid. Now, the co-author of that report, Professor Virginia Tilley, came to London, came to the UK in July and spoke at the Pal Expo event, at PSC's meeting at the Pal Expo event, and she gave what I thought there was a very condensed and powerful definition of apartheid, a far more condensed version. And she said apartheid exists when the state is the guardian and enforcer of the system of discrimination. And the point she was making was that racial discrimination exists in just about any liberal democracy across the world that you could name, but apartheid exists when the state is not battling or seeking to overcome the structure of discrimination, but where the state is the guardian and enforcer of that system of discrimination. Now, it is difficult, I would say, for any serious analyst to contest that the system imposed by Israel over Palestinians in the occupied territories, particularly in the West Bank and East Jerusalem, it'd be very difficult to contest that that does not constitute apartheid, with separate systems of laws applied to settlers and Palestinians, separate planning processes, roads and transport systems to which Palestinians are denied access. Desmond Tutu, as you all know, stated when he visited the West Bank many years ago that the situation in his view was worse than that suffered by black South Africans under South African apartheid. Even John Kerry, as he prepared to end his term as Secretary of State, said that if the occupation did not end, then Israel would have to be defined as an apartheid state. But the label of apartheid is also relevant when we describe the policy and application of law within the State of Israel. Adalah, the Israeli Legal Rights Centre, has identified over 50 laws which specifically discriminate against Palestinian citizens of Israel, as I've said, make up about 20% of the population. Now, there isn't space or time here to adumbrate them all. One with which you may be familiar, you may not, but to me is one of the starkest, is a law called the Acceptance to Communities Law. This is a law that legitimizes Jewish towns in Israel of a certain size, legitimizes them excluding Palestinians from residing within those towns. So 43% of Israeli towns have something called residential admission committees that filter out applicants on the grounds, and I'm quoting from the law, of, quote, incompatibility with the social and cultural fabric. In other words, if you moved into this town, which is uniquely and wholly Jewish, you would disturb the social and cultural harmony of the town. These committees are, in the words of Human Rights Watch, again I'm quoting, used to exclude Arabs from living in rural Jewish communities. In a liberal democracy, the state should be officially neutral with respect to the ethnic and any other ascriptive identity of its citizens, so that all members of all ethnic groups enjoy the same citizenship rights. The nationalism officially espoused by the state in most liberal democracies is civic nationalism, which makes no reference to any specific ethnic identity. The nationalism of the Israeli state is not Israeli nationalism, but Zionism. That is Jewish nationalism. So when Israel defines itself as a Jewish state, this does not mean that it is a state which is Jewish in the same way that we might perhaps, this might be contested, but we might perhaps refer to the UK as a Christian state, i.e. as a state where the majority are Christian, where Christian tradition and culture might be seen to predominate, to flourish. Rather, the Jewish state means a state where the rights of Jewish citizens are privileged above those of non-Jews. This formulation is being made specifically clear in a bill that is currently working its way through the Knesset called the Nation-State Bill. It's a bill that some commentators have described as dragging the apartheid nature of the Israeli state out of the closet. It's not in some ways adding anything new, but it is formalising some of the aspects of the character of the Israeli state. And it states clearly, it redefines basic law. It says that Israel is the nation state of the Jewish people, and that the right to self-determination within the state is unique to the Jewish people. It is not a right that exists for Palestinian citizens of the state. So, Balfour was an imperialist act founded upon racist assumptions that led to the establishment of a state that in its foundation and subsequent law and policy has built an unjust structure of power that is exercised over disparate Palestinian communities in different ways. Exercised over Palestinian citizens of Israel through denial of the basic right to live as equal citizens under the law. Exercised over Palestinians in East Jerusalem and the West Bank through a military occupation that this year passed its 50th anniversary and that continues to deny them the fundamental freedoms they need to build meaningful and dignified lives. Exercised over Palestinians living in Gaza through a siege which this year passed its 10th anniversary and which denies them access to basic services, to medicine, to a regular supply of electricity, renders their living conditions so severe that in 2012 the UN produced a report that said unless the siege was lifted then, life in Gaza would become uninhabitable by 2020. And exercised over Palestinians expelled in 1948 and 1967 and their descendants through the fundamental denial of the right of return. Now, if we understand this history and this process all the way back to Balfour, then we can begin to construct an answer to the question that is often thrown at us as activists. And I'm sure there won't be a single person in this room who has not been asked this question. And it's this: why do you campaign on this issue when there are so many other issues of injustice you could be concerned about? Now, sometimes that is asked as a genuine and interested and open inquiry. In fact, I've just been approached by a film producer who wants, for genuine reasons, to make a film addressing that question. Why do people campaign on this issue and what brings them to it? But sometimes, of course, it is asked as part of an attempt to reframe who we are and what we do as a question to which there is a prepared answer. You campaign on this because you hate Israel, and you hate Israel because you are a racist. Now, we know that's not true. Jonathan's just told us it's not true. But there are various answers we can give, I think, to the answer of the question, why do you campaign on this issue? We do not need to claim that this is the gravest injustice in the world, that the oppression of the Palestinian people is worse than any other oppression in human history, that Israel's record of human rights abuses is worse than that of any other nation in the world today. We don't need to say that because I don't believe that it is true. And we don't need to make that claim to justify why we campaign. But Balfour and its anniversary reminds us of two reasons why we do what we do, in my view. Firstly, that what lies at the heart of Palestinian oppression is an unjust structure of power that we can define as apartheid, and it is the world's most enduring example of such a system of oppression. And secondly, Balfour reminds us of Britain's historic complicity and therefore our responsibilities as citizens of the UK. Palestine's history, as David has made abundantly clear, is also Britain's history. It is this understanding, in my view, of the nature of the injustice that we impose that informs our method of response. When we describe ourselves as anti-Zionist, it is not that we believe that the Jewish citizens of Israel do not have rights. It is that the rights that they have are the rights that belong to all people, and that no people have the right to create a state which privileges their rights above the rights of others based on ethnicity, culture, or religion. That is why the demand of the BDS movement, of which PSC is a part, is for a programme of boycott, divestment and sanctions until all aspects of the unjust structure of power which discriminates against Palestinians are addressed. An end to the occupation of the West Bank, Gaza and East Jerusalem, equal rights for the Palestinian citizens of Israel, and recognition of the right of return. We respect the Palestinian call for boycott, divestment and sanctions because we believe that to do otherwise, to continue to provide cultural, economic and political support for Israel's system of apartheid, is to be complicit, to be morally and legally complicit. The act is not hostile to a people, it is one of non-cooperation with a system which is profoundly unjust and profoundly immoral. Now, in conclusion, a wise man, someone much wiser than me, once said, our task is not simply to understand the world, our task is to change it. We are going to look this afternoon, in the sessions this afternoon, about what our campaigning response should be. But I just want to address, in the time I've got left, one thing that you are all being called to do. And my job as the director of PSC is hopefully to provide some information, but my primary task and my primary job is to try and encourage and motivate and mobilise people to action. And one action that we see as crucially important this year is the march on November the 4th. Now, I'm being asked a number of questions. This week someone came to me and said, why are we marching? And what they meant was we're not responding to something immediate. When we came out on the streets in 2014, we were impelled by a sense of righteous indignation, of righteous anger, of righteous shock and horror at the scale of Israel's assault on the people of Gaza that year. This march is a march commemorating all of the key anniversaries that fall this year, but it is a march in which we deliver some key messages to the Palestinian people, and it's a march in which we deliver some key messages to the UK government. And I believe that when we march on November the 4th, we will march in the footsteps of all of those who have marched against unjust structures of power. Those who march protesting for women's rights against the injustice of patriarchy, those who marched in South Africa against the injustice of apartheid. We hope on November the 4th to echo the words of Mother Hubbard, who marched alongside Martin Luther King in Alabama, and when he turned to her and said, "How are you?" she said, "My feet are weary, but my soul is rested." But we march in particular in the footsteps of all of the Palestinians who over 100 years have struggled to be granted the rights and dignity that are owed to all human beings. Now, I want to return to the story of that group of Palestinians of which my great uncle was a part, who came to London in 1921. And as I said, they spent a year in London. During that year, they held what must have been, I've not heard anyone give me a counterclaim, the very first pro-Palestine march to be held in Hyde Park. At the end of their year in London, on behalf of the delegation, my great uncle wrote to Churchill, and he said this, and I'm quoting, "The people of Palestine will not be satisfied with promises that some control of their destiny will be given to them in the future. They will never admit the right of any outside organisation to dispossess them of their country." If you like, he gave on behalf of the Palestinian people to Churchill a promise that the Palestinian people have fulfilled, never to give up the struggle for their rights. So when I march on November the 4th, I will march with those words and that story in my mind, just as I know each of you who are coming to London on November the 4th will come with your own stories of the Palestinians you have met who have inspired you with their endurance, their dignity in the face of oppression, and their resistance. And we will be delivering two clear messages. To the Palestinian people, your cause is not forgotten, and we in the UK in this centenary of Balfour know our responsibilities. We will keep fighting and marching and lobbying until you enjoy justice and equality in your homeland. And to the UK government, acknowledge Britain's historic complicity, but recognise now your current responsibilities to put pressure on Israel to abide by international law and cease its violations of human rights and its operation of an unjust structure of power. The message is really simple. It's time for justice. It's time to make it right for Palestine. Thank you.